네, 그러면은 그 다음으로는 그레고리 스타인 교수님 아까 이미 소개드렸기 때문에 또 다시 드리지 않겠습니다. So, Gregory.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I am honored to have been invited to join this conference today. I would like to thank KS Park and Ji Yun Cho. I appreciate being invited and for their help along the way. I'm also honored to be part of such an interesting and diverse group of scholars here today. My background is in American real estate law, which is different from the other speakers. So as I speak, please remember that this is my starting perspective. The other experts who are going to speak today come from different backgrounds, and that is one of the things that made this conference particularly interesting to me today, to hear the diversity of opinions and the different backgrounds contributing to this one important topic. I am still revising my paper, so I welcome your suggestions and ideas, and I would appreciate any questions you have later on in the afternoon. Let me begin by giving you my outline of my talk, my thesis, my starting premises, so you'll know where I'm going as I proceed. I'll begin by stating my thesis and my underlying assumptions, and we'll talk about those in just a couple of minutes. Next, I will provide a brief background on the sharing economy. I assume most people in the room are familiar with what that means, so I will just go over it in brief. Then I'm going to focus on three important distinctions within the sharing economy, and we'll spend some time talking about those three distinctions. After that, I will distinguish between short-run and long-run effects of the sharing economy. I think the effects in the short run will be particularly worrisome. I'm more optimistic about the long run. Following that, I'll ask whether any type of intervention is warranted. It is possible that we need government intervention. It is possible that we need intervention by the private sector. And we'll talk about who should do the intervening if we intervene at all. And then I will conclude. Let me state my thesis up front, and then you can decide whether I have provided adequate evidence to support it. The sharing economy, to begin with, is causing considerable disruption and rapid change. And I don't think there's too much dispute about that. Some people who are not that well situated to begin with are going to end up even worse off than before, at least in the short run, maybe not in the long run. The sharing economy has some longer run benefits as well. So some of those disadvantages may disappear, and many people may end up better off further down the road. Certain cases, though, are particularly worrisome. They cause the most concern, and that's especially true in settings where there are shortages of important goods. That's where people who may need something desperately aren't able to get it. When there are price spikes for necessities, for example, after natural disasters, the price of certain goods may go up, and that will be particularly worrisome. And with goods that are not elastic, and by elastic I mean in the economic sense, goods that are slow to be replaced, where it takes a long time to expand supply. And another particularly worrisome case is public goods, goods that are provided by the government as opposed to being provided by the private sector. This, again, raises the question of whether there should be some sort of intervention, either by the government or by the private sector, and if so, what that type of intervention should be. I think everybody agrees that we want to protect those who are most vulnerable, those who could suffer most from disruption in the sharing economy, but at the same time, we don't want to stifle innovation and change. The benefits of the sharing economy do accrue to many people, and we want to make sure that that can continue at the same time that we are protecting the people who are the most vulnerable. And that is the difficult trade-off that I will talk about more later on. Let me turn now to my assumptions. These are things I am not going to attempt to support. I think everybody will agree with them, but if not, please let me know during the question and answer session. My starting assumption, which I think is hard to disagree with, is that inequality exists. I am just going to assume that that is true. I will also assume that people disagree as to why that inequality exists. I'm not going to weigh in on whether there is systemic unfairness that causes inequality or whether less affluent people bring this on themselves. I know there are some people who feel one way, others who feel the other way. I have my own pretty strong views on that subject, but that is not my topic for today. So we'll leave that aside. I will also assume that goods and services used to have a single price. Until the sharing economy started to take off, I think most people would agree that prices were set, and prices didn't change very often. If they did increase or decrease, it did not happen that quickly, and it did not happen that frequently. Two things have changed to make that no longer true. First of all, nearly everybody carries a smartphone in their pocket. That is a supercomputer that everybody has with them all the time. The second thing that has changed is that vendors have developed very sophisticated apps that can connect supply with demand and set an equilibrium price that is constantly changing. So prices now for many commodities go up and down very quickly, and that was not formerly the case. Just one illustration that's true, I was drawing on the American experience when I used this illustration, but today, talking with KS at lunch, I know it's true in Seoul as well, the difference between taxis and Uber. Traditional taxis in most places charge a price that is set based on the distance that you travel and on the amount of time the ride takes. That price didn't change very often. Those are usually set by government regulators. Uber, by contrast, charges a price that is based on supply and demand at the exact moment when you request the ride. That means the same ride 30 minutes later might cost a lot more or a lot less, depending on supply and demand. So the price of a taxi was, and in many cases still is, fixed. The price of an Uber ride increases or decreases with supply and demand. My last assumption, and I think this one is a little harder to support because I'm more predicting the future. My last assumption is that dynamic pricing is probably here to stay. The sharing economy and dynamic pricing are not going to change. And by dynamic pricing, I mean the type of pricing I was just speaking about, pricing that goes up and down with supply and demand. Let me speak a little bit about the sharing economy, a little bit of background. To begin with, I think the name sharing economy is inaccurate and somewhat misleading. It goes by other names that have become popular as well, but not as popular, the gig economy, for example. There's really not that much sharing going on. People are not giving away things for free. And when I think of sharing, I think of giving something without charge. The sharing economy is, for the most part, not people giving things away for free. If anything, I think it should be called the anti-sharing economy. 5 years ago, your friend might let you stay in their extra bedroom for free. Now that friend has been using that room to earn money on Airbnb. They know exactly what that room is worth. They may not be so willing to give it to you for free because they know exactly what they're giving up. So I think sharing is quite misleading. The sharing economy also leads to greater commodification. And by commodification, I mean everything is now viewed as a commodity, including that spare bedroom that your friend used to let you have. Everything is commoditized. Everything has a value. I think of it, and again, this is the real estate lawyer in me, I think of it as more of a leasing or subleasing economy. In English and American common law, scholars speak of property as a bundle of sticks. That is the metaphor that the English common law came up with. When you own property, it is actually a bundle of rights. Property is the ownership of many smaller rights. So when you own property, you have the right to use it, you have the right to occupy, you have the right to exclude people. The sharing economy takes that bundle of sticks, that bundle of rights, and breaks it into smaller and smaller piles. So it used to be that you might lease an apartment for 6 months, or if you needed a hotel stay, you might stay for a few days. Now you can use Airbnb for 3 or 4 nights, and you can use Uber as a sharing platform for 15 minutes. All we're doing is taking property rights and making them smaller and smaller, leasing them out on shorter and shorter terms. Another bit of background about the sharing economy is that there are new middlemen, new intermediaries, standing between the buyer and the seller. Now, to some extent, the sharing economy has led to disintermediation, meaning the intermediaries go away. We've removed some of the middlemen. For example, fewer people use travel agents than it used to. It used to be that if you were booking a vacation, you would contact a travel agent. There aren't very many travel agents left because of the availability of the sharing economy. Fewer people start looking for a house by using a real estate agent. They can investigate houses for themselves online. What we've really done, though, I think, is replaced one intermediary with another. The old intermediaries have gone away, but new intermediaries are rising up to replace them. And let me give you an example. I have season tickets to my home university's basketball team. It has a very good basketball team, and we go to all the games. 10 years ago, if I had to miss a game, I would scalp my tickets. Scalpers are people who stand in front of the arena, they buy tickets from some people, and then resell them at a profit. Dealing with a scalper is very inconvenient. It meant if I was missing the game, I would have to drive to the arena, negotiate with somebody outside the arena, and sell my tickets, knowing that they were going to then sell them to somebody else for a profit. Well, there was a game on Saturday. I was on the airplane coming here, and I had to miss the game. I didn't have to deal with a scalper. I put my tickets on Vivid Seats, which is the platform that our university uses, and I was able to sell my tickets just with a few clicks. I never had to negotiate with anybody, and I will receive money for my tickets because I use them as the new scalper. They are the new intermediary. It's cleaner, it's easier, it has an insurance policy that comes with it, and as a result, there is far more transacting than there used to be. I could not have sold Saturday's tickets before the growth of that platform. And once again, that has been enabled by smartphones and by applications that people have come up with to allow this sort of trading to continue. Now, I will focus on one particular feature of the sharing economy, and that is dynamic pricing. Again, dynamic pricing is pricing that changes from time to time. It's not pricing where the price is fixed and established. You can have sharing without dynamic pricing, and I think the Airbnb example is a good example. Many homes that are listed, many apartments that are listed on Airbnb, the price doesn't change. Either you rent the apartment or not, but the price is not going to be different tomorrow than it was today. You can also have dynamic pricing without sharing. For example, airline tickets are priced dynamically. The price changes from minute to minute, even though that is not really the sharing economy. What we are seeing more of, though, is that dynamic pricing and the sharing economy appear together. As the sharing economy has expanded, we're seeing greater use of dynamic pricing. A very important question with dynamic pricing is what happens when demand suddenly increases and supply cannot meet it. This is a difference between the old economy and the new economy. For most old economy goods, the price would stay fixed for a long time and there would be a shortage. The commodity would then be distributed largely by chance. So for example, let's suppose you want to catch a taxi and it's starting to rain. All of a sudden there's increased demand for taxis, but the supply cannot increase because the number of taxis is limited. What that means is some people who need a taxi aren't going to get one. And the taxis that are available will be distributed mostly by chance. If you get lucky, you get a taxi. If you don't get lucky, you have to walk. With Uber, that's different. The price will go up because there's a shortage. The dynamic pricing will cause the price to increase. Drivers who may be sitting home enjoying leisure time might then decide to go back on the road, and that will cause the price to come back down. But during the shortage, the price is what is determining who gets a taxi, or who gets an Uber, rather. The price will go up, and the people who get the Uber are the people who can afford it and are willing to pay the increased price. So instead of the commodity being distributed on the basis of luck, it is now being distributed on the basis of price. Earlier, I mentioned that I would discuss three important distinctions within the sharing economy, and let me turn to that now. The three that are listed on the slide are necessities versus luxuries, elastic versus inelastic goods, and public versus private goods. And let me speak about each of those for a couple of minutes. Necessities versus luxuries. A necessity is something you absolutely have to have. It is necessary for life. A luxury is something that you don't need to have, and it's just a good that is purely for enjoyment. Now, there's not really a distinction so much as a spectrum. We have a scale from necessity to luxury, and goods fall in different places along the scale. So it's not a yes or a no question. It's more, where does your particular commodity fall on the spectrum? Keep in mind also that some goods are necessities for some people and luxuries for other people, or unnecessary for other people. For example, certain medicines may be needed by some people to stay alive. Other people don't need them. Some goods that are not necessities can leave you at a very large disadvantage if you don't have them. Higher education, for example. You can live without a higher education, but it will put you at a disadvantage in the competition for various goods and for jobs, of course. So it's not, strictly speaking, a necessity, but it's something that's very important. Another thing to remember is that your status can change during your lifetime. Something that was a luxury or unnecessary at one point in your life could become a necessity later on as you go older. So what that means is even though there's a difference between necessities and luxuries, it's not so much a one or the other, it's a question of where you fall on the spectrum, keeping in mind that your status can change over time. The second distinction I want to discuss is elastic versus inelastic goods. And again, elastic goods are goods that are easy to replace quickly during a shortage. If there is a shortage of Uber drivers, as I mentioned earlier, more drivers can get on the road, so supply will increase rapidly and the price will drop back down. By contrast, if there is a shortage of housing after a big storm, it may take 1 or 2 years to replace existing housing. That is something that is more inelastic because you cannot replace housing very quickly. Even more inelastic are public goods, such as highways and airports. If your city needs a new airport, it might take 10 years to replace it. That is an extremely inelastic good. Again, let me give you an example. I grew up in New York, which is the largest city in the U.S., and I live not far from Nashville, which is a much smaller city in the U.S., Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville is much smaller than New York. New York is probably 20 times the population. But hotel rooms in Nashville cost quite a bit more than they cost in New York. If I travel to New York, I can get a hotel room for $200 a night. In Nashville, it's $400 or $500, so it's often double the price. The reason is pretty simple. Nashville is growing very fast, and it's a big tourist destination now. The hotel companies cannot keep up with demand, and they're building hotels as rapidly as they can, but they have not caught up with tourist demand, and that means hotels in the city cost double what they cost in New York. Hotels are an inelastic good. It takes a long time to replace them, and what that means is the price stays high. The third distinction I want to highlight is between public goods and services and private goods and services. And again, public goods are goods that are provided by the government. Private goods and services are goods and services that are provided by non-government actors. Some services are public because they are inherently national. There's really no other way to provide them. For example, national defense. Other services are public because only the public sector can provide them, or nearly so, even though they're not inherently public. Some examples would include prisons, mail delivery, and highways. Those don't have to be public, but it makes more sense most of the time that they are. And some services are public because of free rider problems. And a good example of this is environmental protection, if you consider that a service. If I choose to pollute, I will still breathe clean air if my neighbors don't. So that means I can enjoy the benefits that other people are creating without contributing to them myself. Again, there's overlap in these categories. Some goods are public at some times and private at other times. Some of the examples I gave, for example, prisons can be privately provided. Mail delivery can now be provided by FedEx, which is not a government entity. But public goods and services are probably where we want the greatest amount of responsiveness because the government provides them to all people rather than private corporations, which are providing benefits primarily to their shareholders. There are also goods that are mixtures. In the US, many utilities are publicly owned, provide electricity and water. Others are privately owned, but they're heavily regulated. So they're somewhat public and somewhat private. The same may happen to social media soon. It's a private entity. Facebook is private, but someday may be heavily regulated or even become part of the public. So to summarize, goods and services can fall in different places on each of these three matrices. They can be necessities or luxuries, elastic or inelastic, or public or private. From my perspective, some types of commodities are the ones we need to worry about more than others. Necessities, because they are necessities and people have to have them. Inelastic goods, because it's difficult to replace them. And public goods, because there's much more of a public trust. The government is supposed to be acting for the benefit of the public. But what we're really discussing here more generally is how society should allocate scarce resources. And that is a question that goes beyond the sharing economy. These recent innovations simply highlight it. My biggest concerns, though, are with necessities because people need them, with inelastic goods because they are hard to replace, and with public goods because the government holds them for the benefit of the public. Let me turn now to a discussion of the difference between short-run and long-run effects of the sharing economy. In the short run, I fear that less affluent people may suffer. And talking at lunch, I understand that's true in Seoul in the taxi industry. And they may suffer more than they used to in the old economy. Goods that increase in price go up in price either because they are necessities, which means demand cannot go down, or because they're inelastic, which means that supply cannot go up. What that means is the things you need the most get the most expensive exactly when you need them the most. So when there's a shortage of something important that can't be replaced easily, the price will go up, and it's very hard to increase the supply. And that means less affluent people will suffer because the price of these necessities and these inelastic goods will go up just when they need things the most. At the same time, less affluent, poorer people may enjoy some offsetting benefits. Some goods will be cheaper. Maybe they are luxury goods, maybe they are elastic goods, things you don't need as much, but some things will become less expensive because of dynamic pricing. If we learn about shortages more quickly, there will also be work alleviating those shortages. So if you are somebody with less money and you realize that there is short-term work that you can do to resolve a shortage, like going on duty for Uber as a driver, or working in construction for new housing, that means you will have more job opportunities in the short run than you had in the past. There's also likely to be more menu pricing, and by menu pricing I mean the basic price for a stripped-down, bare-bones version of a good will be quite low, but there will be different things you can add on, and airline tickets are a good example. You can get a basic airline ticket fairly cheaply, but you will pay more money if you want to check your bag or if you want to have a reserved seat, and that means you can get a basic ticket for less money than in the past. Let me turn to the longer run now. In the longer run, I think less affluent people may enjoy certain benefits that will appear as the sharing economy ages a little bit. Producers of goods will learn about shortages more quickly and can reduce those shortages, and that means that prices will drop faster and goods will become more available sooner than they did in the past. There will be more work, as I mentioned, in alleviating those shortages. Goods will become cheaper off-peak. Some restaurants charge lower prices earlier in the day because they want to fill up their tables when the restaurant is less popular. And flights and highways in the US at least have become cheaper at undesirable times. So some roads charge a lower fee if you travel at a less popular time. New options will also appear. Uber has started Uber Pool, where several people can ride in the same car at the same time. It takes longer to get to your destination, but it costs less. So you can decide whether you'd rather spend more money or spend more time. I have a young niece who uses Uber Pool all the time. She would rather save money even if it takes more time. I would rather use regular Uber. I'd rather save time even if it takes more money. So different people have different options. There will also be greater opportunities to afford commodities that you could not in the past. And this will happen in two different ways. You may be able to use something on a sharing basis that you couldn't afford or didn't need, like an automobile. If you need a car once or twice a week for a couple of hours, you don't need to buy one if you can share one. The other way prices will drop is you can buy a car that you couldn't afford in the past, knowing that you can drive one day a week for Uber to help pay the bills. So you can have more opportunities both as a landlord and as a tenant. The other thing to remember is that the long term will arrive more quickly than it did in the past because things are happening so much faster with dynamic pricing. Let me turn to the question that I said I would end with, which is whether intervention is warranted, and if so, who should do the intervening. One possibility that I'm sure everybody has thought of is the government could intervene in the sharing economy. That might work. Governments are powerful. But there are several drawbacks to government action. It will distort a market that is developing rapidly and in unexpected ways. Innovative industries will oppose this, as we've already seen with Airbnb and Uber and scooters in cities. The government sometimes makes things worse. They intervene and it actually doesn't help. It actually makes the problem worse. And the government will probably be too late. They will always be solving the problem that arose yesterday and not solving the problem that's arising now. A second possibility is intervention by the private sector. And this is a case where the private sector companies can actually provide some benefit, perhaps because they're trying to avoid government control. The beneficiaries of changes from the sharing economy might agree to provide some benefit to those who are suffering. In economic terms, what they are doing is internalizing externalities. These companies have caused external effects to harm other people, and the government is making sure that those external effects are reduced. These companies might do it because they see it as the right thing to do. For example, Lyft once stated, Lyft is a competitor to Uber, that they would help to retrain drivers who lose their jobs when self-driving cars arrive. They know that their drivers will be out of work, and they said that they would help to retrain them. They may view it as the right thing to do, or they may do it because they think if they do it on their own, the government will not intervene. The private sector can also make things better by introducing the type of tiered pricing I mentioned a moment ago. You could have different prices for different levels of quality of the good, and that means that some people will afford the basic good and other people will be able to pay for the fancier version of the good. We could have intervention by the government and the private sector together, working together, although I'm not terribly optimistic based on what has happened so far. Or we could have no regulation at all. We could just decide that regulators cannot keep up with innovative industries. And the government could say, we're not going to try, we don't want to make things worse, we're just going to let things happen and see what the results are. Governments might fear that industry will try to control what the regulations are, and we've seen that as well. Uber, for example, has very heavily lobbied legislatures to make sure that they get government regulation that is helpful to them. Perhaps the government will decide that it wants to see what the new equilibrium will be before it acts. It wants to see how things settle down after the sharing economy has been around for a while. We need to see what the problems are before we actually try to solve them, because it's a mistake to solve the problem if we're not exactly sure what it is. Another point to remember is that today's winners could be tomorrow's losers. Companies that look very successful today will not necessarily be successful tomorrow. Everybody thought WeWork was going to be a great IPO just a few months ago, and now WeWork is struggling to survive, and Uber has been having problems as well. So maybe there's no need for intervention because the problems will solve themselves. Let me finish with some conclusions and some predictions, and it's always a risk to predict the future, but I will try a little bit. One conclusion and prediction that I will offer is that technological change will continue to make any solution we come up with obsolete. We have not suddenly reached the end of change. The most recent invention is not the last one we will see, and technologies will continue to advance. If anything, changes are getting faster. Just like the iPhone, some other new development will come along in a few years and disrupt everything once again, and it could happen sooner than we think. There's no reason to think that this constant change is suddenly over just because we are here now. My other conclusion, which is more, maybe less of a prediction, I guess, is that we have several goals, and those goals conflict with each other. On the one hand, we want to encourage these kinds of developments because, for the most part, people benefit from them, or at least we don't want to harm these kind of developments. At the same time, we want to protect people who are harmed by disruption, and that is particularly true when the disruption is sudden and when it is unexpected. A good example, once again, is taxi drivers who, without knowing it was coming, all of a sudden found their livelihood threatened. They have not had time to adjust, and what we want to do in the short run is protect them at the same time that we are not inhibiting innovation. Transfer payments would work, and I think it's possible for the beneficiaries to provide money or other benefits to those who suffer, but I'm not sure if that's the wisest approach. We could tax beneficiaries to help ease the pain for people who are suffering, or to help retrain those people. Even better, though, I think, is the job re-education option. Instead of giving those who are suffering from the new economy money, you help them adapt to the new economy by training them for the jobs of the future. We also have to remember to be sure that those people are provided with the essential technology. You cannot participate in this economy if you don't have a smartphone. You cannot participate if you don't have broadband internet access, and you cannot participate if you don't have a credit card. If you don't have any of those things, you will be left behind in the new economy, and that is not what we want to see. I'll close by reminding everybody that the disruptors here do bear some responsibility. It was great to invent the iPhone, but that invention damaged people whose jobs became obsolete. Who is going to pay to clean that up? And I do believe that the disruptors have some responsibility here. I'm happy to try to answer any questions you have, although I think we're doing that later. And my name and my email address are up there on the slide for those who want to get in touch with me. I'd like to thank you, and I appreciate it. Thanks.
네, 역시 그 공유경제의 그 전반적인 그 긍정적인 측면을 살리기 위해서 어떤 측면에서 누가 규제의 주체가 되어야 하는지에 대한 그 질문을 어떤 방식으로 답해야 되는지에 대해서 여러 관점을 보여주신 것 같습니다. 특히 그 이 다이내믹 프라이싱, 과거에는 택시 가격이 그대로 택시 가격은 항상 똑같이 정해져 있어서 과거에는 운에 따라서 혼잡할 때도 택시 잡기 어려울 때도 운에 따라서 택시를 잡을 수가 있었다면 이 플랫폼을 통해서 다이나믹 프라이싱을 하게 되면 결국에 돈을 더 많이 지불할 수 있는 사람이 차량을 먼저 잡게 되기 때문에 이런 의도하지 않았던 불평등도 올 수 있다는 부분이 좀 인상적이었습니다.